Okay, so that's Homer Warner. So now let's talk about Larry Weed. So I introduced kind of this concept of rebellion for Homer Warner as being rooted in ignorance. Recognition of his own ignorance, seeing the unfortunate ignorance of the nurse and the others around him, and then working on how can we change this. Larry Weed's rebellion is rooted in the contrast between what he saw as the careful, methodical work that he did as a basic scientist, a biochemist, where he worked on one or two problems at a time, was very focused on them, worked them up in detail until he fully understood them, and then he published on them, versus the chaotic, frantic multitasking of the clinic that he worked. So he's all, what's more, we have lives at stake here, and we are far less careful in how we are approaching things than we are with these molecules and things in our labs that don't have any immediate life and death consequences. So he'd say the beginning clinical clerk, the new intern, and the practicing physician are confronted with an apparent contradiction. Each is asked as a whole physician to accept the obligations of meeting many problems simultaneously, and yet to give to each the single-minded attention that is fundamental to developing and mobilizing his or her enthusiasm and skill. So we're asking a physician, like take an ICU setting, 30 patients, and you're supposed to give your full to every one of them. It's just impossible. How many people think that you're good multitaskers? Anyone read about how psychologists say that humans are really terrible at multitasking? But there's a lot of, I can't even single task well. So, there's a belief amongst many people that, you multitask, and I think all the psychologists, you multitask, your performance and everything goes down. And yet that is what we're asking physicians to do. We are almost demanding that physicians are continually operating in a multitasking environment, chaotically often. So Don Detmer, who was the famous physician in the United States, said Larry Weed is one of the giants of the last 500 years in medical thinking. 500 years, that's a claim. Okay, so what is, here's Larry Weed, who passed away about 3 years ago. He was also in his 90s. Okay, this is a little bit out of order. I thought my mistake on the slides here. Larry Weed became famous in the 60s for introducing soap notes. So prior to that, medical documentation didn't really have any real structure. It was often really hard to find the information that you needed. And so in papers in mid-60s, he published about this, and then there was a New England Journal of Medicine article that he published in the late 60s that really got him on the, everyone's attention. And so what's a soap note? So Larry Weed is arguing that what we document about a patient needs to be ordered. So it can be searched. We can look for things and find what we need. So he argued that notes should be structured as follows. You should start off with the subjective elements. What is the patient telling you about herself? What is she saying about her history or her and I'm not a physician, so those of you that have actually written soap notes, you can correct later. But the patient's description of their situation. And then there's the objective element. What is the physician observing? What have I measured if I did a blood pressure or a temperature? So that's the data gathering. Okay, so then there's the assessment, which is the summary of the patient, lists of differential diagnoses, what I think might be the causes of what is being presented to me. And then there's a plan. What am I going to do next? Am I going to order some tests to eliminate things from my list of possible explanations, or am I going to instantiate a therapy? But they should be structured and be scientific. And I will have to update my slides here, which, okay, I'm just out of order. Okay, so why was Weed so concerned about documentation? So in his mind, the medical record is the database. And there's a famous lecture from Emory University where Larry Weed's doing the grand rounds that we will almost assuredly have you watch later in the semester, where he describes this. The record is the database from which medical reasoning proceeds. No database about the patient, there could be no scientific reasoning about that patient. Right? So how many people have had a database class? Who's heard of the term cockroach motel? Anyone know what a cockroach motel is? Okay, cockroach? We generally don't like cockroaches. So a cockroach motel is something that a cockroach goes into and never comes out of. Right? So so I think what Larry Weed would say, oftentimes our documentation, think 50s and 60s, is like a cockroach motel. All this data gets written into it, but no one could ever pull any information or knowledge out of it because they can't find things. Okay, so I got to back up a little bit here because I got my slides out of order. So Charlie Safran, who's a physician at Harvard Medical School and a prominent informaticist, was interviewed by The Economist in a piece they did about Larry Weed, which is one of the articles posted for your further reading. And so Charlie Safran starts by making an analogy between Larry Weed and a famous Viennese physician. So in the mid-19th century, the mortality rate from, I can't say these words, puerperal or childbed fever at Vienna General Hospital's maternity ward was so high that many women, it is said, preferred to give birth in the street. Then a doctor called Ignaz Semmelweis achieved a dramatic reduction in deaths by insisting that doctors wash their hands between autopsies and obstetrical examinations. Is anyone cringing? When I saw some cringes. So wash your hands between cutting open a dead body and examining a woman for birth. Other doctors refused to believe that their own hands transferred disease. Besides, they grumbled, hand washing was far too time-consuming. Dr. Semmelweis was widely ridiculed and eventually fired. Okay, so that's the analogy that Charlie Safran wants you to make about Larry Weed. So so Semmelweis is to hand washing as Weed is to medical documentation. Is that why people hated Larry Weed? Because he said we should organize our notes? Not at all. The soap took over the world. I mean, soap notes are used everywhere. So that was a obvious influence that was received positively by Larry Weed. But he did not stop there. Remember, the medical record was the database from which medical reasoning proceeded. He wasn't only interested in the database. He was interested in the medical reasoning. And like I said, Uwe Reinhardt said that Larry Weed never read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Because you don't need to know the Dale Carnegie, but you should get from the title of the book, how to get along, how to persuade people, how to get people to be on your team. Larry Weed was the caustic rebel. So he challenged the fundamental assumptions of medicine. So this is a quote of his. The unaided human mind is not a reliable instrument for the processing of information in the solution of patients' problems. Yet medical education and licensure permit physicians to try exactly that. I had the privilege of, I only met Larry Weed once in person when I was in graduate school. He came to Salt Lake City and was pitching a tool of his to LDS Hospital. And in his talk, he said basically psychologists proved in the 50s that doctors cannot do their jobs. Those kind of sound like fighting words. What do you think he might mean by that? Well, and every psychologist I've talked to has confirmed this basic thing. So experiments done in the 50s showed that the human mind can effectively manage about a 5-by-5 table. So you think of that, about 5 diseases and then 5 findings or symptoms. That's, regardless of what the field is, that's what the human mind can do. And so what kind of tends to happen is you get your 5 favorite columns and your 5 favorite rows, and that's kind of how you operate. Now that's a simplification. But like diabetes, there might be 300 variables that could be monitored about diabetes. And then, it's all the different values or whatever they might have. Modern medicine, just like everything else, is a very large table. And it's not, human minds are just not tasked for that. Another great provocative, he's just so provocative, it's just, And I used to say if you ever get a chance to hear him speak, you definitely should, but he passed away, so you got to find videos of him. Okay, the diplomas medical schools grant and the licensing exams the governments give could not possibly mean and guarantee what the public think they mean. Okay, so fighting words. I took it out for time, but Homer Warner was a department chair, founded a journal. He was very much in the system. He was a Ben Franklin. Larry Weed, very great credentials, graduated from Yale Medical School, did residencies at he graduated from Columbia Medical School, sorry. Did residency at Johns Hopkins University, just top tier medical schools. He was ultimately an outsider. He found it, he went and did his great things outside of the academy. So who inspired Larry Weed? So Homer Warner, as I mentioned before, and then we have like a philosopher, kind of, because the philosopher is on your supervising committee, so that makes you a philosopher of sorts. And we're all doctors of philosophy, right? So we're supposed to be philosophical. So Larry Weed points to Francis Bacon, Alfred North Whitehead, and others on it. So I'm going to share some of, and these are from Larry Weed's own writings that I'm going to share with you, of what he drew from these people in framing what he thought informatics should be about. So Francis Bacon's Idols of the Mind. And so I have an old PDF that from Larry Weed that doesn't seem to be on the internet anymore, so I couldn't figure out how to put the reference in it for the slides. But there's 4 things, 4 idols of the mind, and I linked to something at Stanford's online Encyclopedia of Philosophy that you can read just a short section about this in more detail. So first off, Francis Bacon recognized the universal mental limitations inherent in human nature. Our minds have problems. And I think one of the most important things when we think about medical diagnosis and decision making is we are functioning with all sorts of biases. And so somehow, if we're going to be doing optimal decision making, we need to be doing things to protect ourselves from our own limitations. There's the acquired beliefs of human problem solvers corrupts the light of nature. So we don't just see the data in front of us. We see the data in front of us in terms of our prior expectations or our belief systems or our past experience from the last week. So we can't just see things truly as they are. We're always seeing them through some filtering lenses. The limits of language throw everything into confusion. Human language is not a formal system. It's not designed to avoid ambiguity, like a mathematics language or a programming language. And so we're always struggling with the confusion inherent in language. And then develop systems of thought which have become inveterate by tradition, implicit credence, and neglect. I can't think differently because the authorities all tell me this is how it is. Our hands could not possibly transmit disease. So those are things that we're all facing, these 4 idols of the mind. Okay. Another, Larry Weedle referenced Alfred North Whitehead a lot, who was a British, then American philosopher and mathematician. And I want you to think about this. I think this is a great provocative quote. It is a profoundly erroneous truism that we should cultivate the habit of thinking about what we are doing. The precise opposite is the case. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. So do we want our physicians to not be thinking about things? Or do we have a limited capacity, a bandwidth of what we can be thinking about, so we want to automate things that can be and leave the human mind freer for other things so that they can focus on those?